Oh, my, Mr. Brandon Cruz, looking beautiful as always. Thank you all for joining us. We are back with Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. We have episode 52. Muscle has medicine. Hypertrophy is a vehicle for health. So this one's going to be pretty cool. I'm sure me and you will have some interesting conversations about it. Let's see. I'm going to go with my last 7 days. Let's see.
Let's do it.
Things have been really, really good. Business has been good. I'll be on Boom America. So I'm kind of planning my travel to be able to fly back and forth to Tampa. The team's been super good about being like, hey, if you need us to step up to handle stuff, we got you while you're traveling. Clients have been super supportive. So it's going to be weird to kind of do that, but it's been exciting, man. I've been kind of trying to think about like what my talks are going to be when I start doing this stuff, because they have a battle plan. But I'm just real grateful for the opportunity, and a good friend of mine, Jason Scooby Prep, got me that opportunity. So nice. He would never tell anybody, but it's just been cool to kind of work on that. And then the YouTube channel for Relentless, we did our first Q&As. We got those going up.
Hey, let's
go. Those are fun, man. Like, we were all talking, the three of us, like, it was fun to sit there for 2 hours and just talk, shop like you and I do a lot, you know what I mean? Absolutely. And have it recorded. And it turned out really well. Next time you're in Nashville, we'll have to do a Q&A when you're there as like a special guest with us. So otherwise, went to a beautiful dinner at Eddie V's Saturday night, just to get out and kind of just clear my head and stuff like that, and smoking cigars, and life's good. Oh, B, I just got to tell you something, man. I feel so good on keto. Like, I am like full on in ketosis now. Like I used a little Humalog yesterday to kind of drive it in.
Okay. Are you checking your BHB levels and stuff? Are you using?
Yeah, I'm checking my ketones.
Yeah, yep. Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm checking blood and I'm checking my BGs. So like I'm running like 77 on BGs and ketones anywhere from 1.3 to 1.6. So I'm pretty good on that, on the glucose to ketone. But dude, my mind, my body, I just feel so much better, and that's when I was like telling someone, they're like, you just jumped into a fad, because you saw it work with other people. It's like, man, legitimately, since 2017, since I got off fucking stage, really in 16, Jason and I have pushed me to 6 meals. And I just think what happened is I had 6 years of visceral fat gain very slowly, because I used a little bit of GH for my bones, because it helps my bone health and my joint health. I've been on it since I was 12. And I just think that slowly over time, I kind of got some issues. And I think it's just done good to have, if anything, it's been a mental break. It feels nice not being stuffed on carbs. I don't know what else to say.
We have to realize from a cognitive perspective that nutrition not only impacts our physiology, but also our psychology. So we have to think about it. Nutrition is not just energy in terms of chemical energy, but if you're weighed down, let's think about it in the perspective of when we're in an off season. I don't know about you, but I have to get up. When I was like actually bodybuilding, I was up 600 to 800 grams of carbs a day. I felt lethargic all the time, even when I had, really, like, I would do a lot of cream of rice meals because they sat easy with me. They digested very quickly and readily. But anytime we're pushing the extremes, there are these differences between the pendulum that we swing between, and we have to realize for every gimme there's a gotcha. So you're filled out with carbohydrates. You might be a little bit more lethargic. For some people, their cognition is off. There was a time, I'll tell you, I'm not a big advocate for fasting, but I will tell you that there was a period of my life for about 1.5 years I was traveling excessively. I mean, we're talking 40,
and it's easier to fast when you travel, for sure.
It is 40 to 45 weeks a year. I was traveling. I did intermittent fasting, and I didn't see decrements in my muscle. I'll tell you this: I didn't lose muscle. I didn't gain muscle though. So
you just held neutral.
Exactly, and so I believe that there, and we covered this at the end of last week's podcast. There is applicability for every single tool. We have all these different tools that we could utilize, but it's about choosing the right tool for the right job, for the right individual, in the right circumstance. So this is what's working for you, given where you're at in your life, in your career, and in your pursuit of specific goals.
Yeah. And this is like what I told Jason. He's like, dude, it's crazy how, because I was telling him, and he's like, you even sound sharper. And I was like, yeah, man. When I found out about my back being broken, and what they told me, it gave me it gave me for once in my bodybuilding career a clear defined goal. I'd always been chasing bigger lengths. Now it's like I can't get them because the back is what it is. So I have to adjust my training. I'll add my size differently. But why not be the best lightweight I can be by removing some of the excess size instead of trying to be welter? And dude, I feel so much better. My back feels better. My hip is almost 100% again. And I just, I like to illustrate this because you're talking to a guy who's been using steroids almost when I'm 48, it'll be 30 years. So I waited, so I mean, you're talking a long time off and on, probably an equal on and off of that. Like I've pretty much been 50-50. I'm very smart about that. Those older guys hammered into me to respect it early on. Like, don't do drugs, don't drink. If you push it, just understand that you gotta come down later. So I think I have my health to that. But I can say as a guy who did that stuff, I wish I had 5 years ago, just focused on being the best lightweight bodybuilder I could have been. I wonder if I could have already been like further along. But at 42, I feel good. I'm making improvements. This is amazing. Like I told people in 2021, you introduced me to steps. You made me do that. You kind of challenged me to try it. So I said, fuck it, I'll try it. I'll put what you're saying to use. And I had a great prep. This time around, it wasn't working for me. I pulled the pin and went a different way nutritionally. And the steps, along with me being in keto, I feel the best I've ever felt. So I tell people, try different shit, have fun.
100%. We are our all N of one experiment. And another thing was, you showed me, I was one of the first people that you sent over your MRI images and stuff too. And when I came down to Tampa to do the Physique Education Collective presentation, you and I had a man-to-man talk, looking at each other in the eye. And I was like, listen, there is no more pushing size for you. You know what I mean? And we had this discussion. It was time to downsize. Another benefit, I would say, from a ketogenic approach, especially during a contest prep, is you don't have to worry about the water weight fluctuations. And with that, you're not carrying around as much water weight, because for every gram of glycogen that we store, and really in someone of your muscularity, you probably have the capacity to store 500 to 600 grams of muscle glycogen and about 100, maybe a little bit over 100 grams of liver glycogen. That's 600 grams just in and of itself. So we take 600 grams and then we times that by 4, the 2,400 grams. So between that, that's 3,000 grams, which is 3 kilograms. You might lose just 6.6 pounds of water just from that. That's an alleviation on your joints, on your knees, all these things, on your hips. It's compounding interest over time in terms of, think about every time you run, it's 2 to 3 times your body weight being compressed on your joints. And especially with someone in your condition, we want to make sure that we're minimizing these impacts and we're really preserving the bone mineral density that you have.
100%. Well, dude, all I will say is this, exactly like you said. I also want to add there, when you're removing that water and you're on this keto, it's a good time to like reset inflammation. And I think that's why I feel so much better, because carbs are inflammatory, high protein's inflammatory. And that's one of the big benefits to going into keto is you got to get there. Now I'm going to tell people this, you got to make sure you do your glucose and ketones, because you can't chew up muscle if you don't get into ketosis. So pay attention. Don't just go, oh, I think I'm going to do this and just do it. You got to like really pay attention and track. It's not something that you intuitively do. You can't intuitively keto to get into keto. I'll put it to you like that.
Yeah. And another thing that I would, just give suggestions and advice to those out there, if they're listening to you and they say, oh, you know what, I want to run a keto experiment. Realize the time in your life that you're in. If you're in a high stress time in your life, I wouldn't suggest it, because we know that carbohydrates help with the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system through the release of serotonin and tryptophan. And I've seen with individuals, and I've actually had this run on blood work for them, that when someone is highly stressed, they go keto, especially with females, they end up secreting more cortisol because they're not having that suppression.
Correct.
In cortisol from the effects from carbohydrates and the release of insulin. Their insulin levels go really low, so it's good for metabolic health, but then they're not getting that benefit of suppressing cortisol, as well as the muscle protein degradation effects that come with insulin, because insulin is anti-catabolic. So if you're in a high stress period in your life, it may not be conducive for a ketogenic approach, especially if muscle preservation or muscle gain is your intention or your goal.
I think where keto works really well is you get a lot of women who've pushed hard in the gym, push carbs, then you've pulled carbs and nothing happened, putting them in and then putting them into maintenance. And then I even then will argue, because I've just paid a lot of attention. I'm getting guests on the Excellence Cartel, some of which I think you might like to bring on to here, but we'll evaluate that, because we do two different things, obviously. But doing a cyclic ketogenic diet is very beneficial for women, having a couple of days of carbs for their thyroid, for their adrenals and things like that. So what you're saying is spot on. But how's your last 7 days been since we went down that little rabbit hole of conversation for a second?
You know what? I know that some people, there's like one person in our audience that doesn't like our recaps, but I fucking love them. So we're going to go with them. But honestly, my last week has been solid, man. I spent the past week deloading, as this was something I had mentioned I was going to do in last episode. So I wrapped up the deload on Sunday. I started a new training cycle yesterday. And then I've also been really active on the podcast scene last week, especially anytime. I don't know about you, Jeff. And actually, I don't have to say that. The audience might not know you, but I do. And so whenever we're pulling back from training or we're pulling back from something, we always fill in that space or that time. It's never like we leave dead time. We can't really relax. So that's been me this last week. So I was really active on the podcast scene the last week. So if anyone out there is interested in hearing other podcasts besides our own that I've been on, I was on 4 this past week. So we had the Mind Muscle Connection by my buddy Jeff Hain that came out just on Wednesday. Then I have the Living Lean podcast hosted by one of my clients, Jeremiah Baer, just came out yesterday. So that's Monday. We have the Wits and Weights podcast hosted by a listener of the show himself, Philip Papp, which just launched today. So that's Tuesday, but by the time this is released, we'll be a couple days out. And then I just finished recording an episode of Eat, Train, Prosper with my boys, Brian Borstein and Aaron Stryker. And that will be out right after this episode gets released. So we got a lot of things in the pipeline. But besides that, I've just, other than focusing on podcasts, I've just been, I reopened my roster because it was the first of the month or the beginning of the month. And so I've just been, working with new clients, doing programming, and then also with consultations. But besides that, man, everything's been good on my end.
Dude, I'm proud of you, man. I want that roster to stay open more, and us, but you figure out how to get more balance. Once you could do that, then it's like the magic out of the magic trick, I guess, at that point.
Yeah.
But I'm glad your voice is better for this week's podcast. You all who keep stealing him for podcasts away from me, be respectful of his voice. We record on Tuesdays. Don't let him record with you. I got to have him pristine and ready to go. He's my bowling china cabinet I got to release. But all right, man, let's get into this. So today is Muscle as Medicine. We're going to talk about hypertrophy as a vehicle for health. So in any of the books you read for longevity, even keto, carb cycling, hormone, everything I've ever read, every study I've ever read always talks about having muscle mass being a clear benefit for living a better, longer, healthier life. So we thought we would delve into that today. Like, how exactly is hypertrophy a vehicle for health? So we're going to kick this off with defining exactly what a health span is and what a lifespan is.
Yes, sir. So, all right, on today's episode, we're going to cover how training and improving our fitness can improve both our lifespan and, even more importantly, our health span, as the process of building muscle and then moving that muscle has profound benefits that go far beyond the cosmetic benefits they provide us with from purely a body composition standpoint. And don't get me wrong, guys, both Jeff and I love the fact that there's multiple benefits from how we look, how we feel in terms of the muscle that we've acquired and the training that we do. But really, how I look at it is both muscle and movement can be looked at as medicine in terms of how they positively affect our health outcomes. So before we actually get into the meat of this topic, I want to define a few of these terms and concepts that are improved through resistance training, aerobic work, and staying physically active on a daily basis. So we're going to look at the dichotomy between health span and lifespan, because a lot of times they're used within the context of the same sentence in podcasts and things of that sort, but they are a little bit different. So, health span is focused more on quality of life, whereas lifespan is focused more on the quantity of life, so years. And we're starting to see that people are living longer in society today, but that doesn't mean that they're living better, as modern medicine has allowed for life extension, but oftentimes that results in individuals essentially prolonging mortality, but living for a longer period of time in a sick and diseased state. And we see that all over the place. Like Jeff always alludes to the fact that he goes to the mall. He's like, if you want to see like the perfect example of average America, go to the shopping mall. And so within that, I personally focus more on improving health span and adding more life to our years rather than simply focusing on adding more years to our life. So when I look at health span, really health span can be broken down into a few categories. So health span is multifactorial and can include things like physical health, which includes our muscle strength, our muscle mass, our muscle function, internal health or metabolic health, which would include cardiovascular health. It would include things like insulin sensitivity, blood glucose regulation, things of that sort. And then also cognitive health, which includes like your brain function, your cognitive abilities, your focus capacity, your memory retention, like all these other things that are downstream from the brain. And so when we look at health, we have to realize health is not just the absence of disease, but it's a state of physical and mental well-being, which provides us or helps to provide us with both resilience and adaptability. And that's huge. It's not just about being able to live. or staying alive, having our ticker keep beating. It's about being able to adapt to the stimuli that we throw at it, both from a training perspective, a life perspective, a nutritional perspective, and then also like all the stresses that we don't actively decide to get into our lives, but that we're still resilient enough to take on and become better for it. And so when we look at health, we also have to look at fitness, because these are all intermingled essentially. So fitness, on the other hand, is the condition of being fit and healthy and being able to execute daily activities with optimal performance, endurance, and strength, with the management of disease, fatigue, and stress. And this is especially important when you look at the definition of fitness, it includes reduced sedentary behavior. So fitness is achieved by focusing on specific attributes or qualities that we wish to possess, which can include things like better body composition, which we could get through increasing muscle and decreasing fat, increasing muscular strength and endurance, improved aerobic fitness, leading to better cardiorespiratory fitness or cardiorespiratory capacity, and increased power. And if you truly want to maximize or optimize any aspect of your fitness, whether that be your body composition, your muscular strength, or your aerobic capacity, you need to ensure your health is in check and in a good place, which is why I always say the statement, like one of my mottos of coaching is, a healthy body is a responsive body. And you will see that if you're in a good state of health, as we need both our physical and mental health to be in a good place to be able to do the training needed to improve our fitness and to have the recovery capacity to adapt to that training and make progress as a result of that adaptation.
Next question we want to cover, topic point. Top predictors of longevity and health span. Now, we do have a lot of this stuff out there talks about those blue zones, or the Mediterraneans, the people who basically had this like lifestyle, which is comprised of nutrition, environmental toxins, XYZ. But what are the top predictors of longevity and health span? Is it like blood glucose? Is it thyroid markers? Is it your sex hormones? Is it the moldy house that you live in? Things like that.
So it is not. So actually, when we look into the literature on like the specific indicators which have been teased out to be predictive of someone's longevity and health across the life course, it's usually 4 key longevity predictors, and that is muscle mass, VO2 max, grip strength, and leg strength. So when we look at muscle mass, if we look at like the data on this, they show that those in the top 2.5% of muscle mass have a 3 times lower likelihood of all-cause mortality compared to those in the bottom 25%. So having more muscle mass, predictive of longevity and health span. VO2 max, which is essentially your aerobic capacity. And this is like, when we look at the literature on this, we see that having a high VO2 max is one of the greatest predictors of decreased mortality. And essentially what we want to do is we want to get this as high as we can early on, because it's essentially providing us, and this is the same thing with muscle mass. I kind of look at this as like investing into a 401k. We're making investments into our health early on so that we have more headroom, so that when we do get older and we start seeing decrements in these things, like loss of muscle mass, loss of muscle strength, loss of aerobic capacity, that we have more to chop away from essentially. And so when we look at the data on this, it's been found that those in the top 2.3% of cardiorespiratory fitness have a 5 times, or this is like 5 times higher or lower likelihood of all-cause mortality. But when we actually look at this in percentages, they have a 504% lower likelihood of all-cause mortality than those in the bottom 25%. So it is, VO2 max is highly correlated with better health span, better health markers, and longer longevity. And then the 2 others are grip strength and leg strength. So essentially what these do is, like, grip strength is a predictor of longevity because it's a proxy for strength and muscle function. And so I think it's important to note, because people may have this question, and even I did early on, is training your grip strength going to lead to better longevity? And it's not. So it's not like we can just independently do nothing, not resistance train, not do aerobic training, not do cardio, all these other things, and live longer just by training our grip. But it's really, what comes down to it is the habits that increase grip strength will increase longevity. And so we know that resistance training going to make us a stronger individual, things of that sort. Staying in good muscular function and strength is going to lead to grip strength being improved. And also, it's a really low barrier of entry way to test longevity. And then the last one is leg strength, which is another important predictor, because the legs are a large muscle group, so they're a great proxy for overall strength and function. And so we also have to keep in mind that greater leg strength will most likely lead to like less falls and lower fracture risk, which is something that is a really big risk towards longevity later in life.
The grip strength that they always talk about in the longevity books. Like they're like, oh, yep, grip strength, grip strength. They got me paranoid now where I'm like, do I use my straps or not when I work out?
No, but if you think about it, how you test grip strength is a hand grip dynamometer. So you could have that in every single physician's office. It's super easy. It's a low barrier for entry. True. It's not like you have to take someone into the gym, especially when we look at like older populations. Like we're not going to be able to get them under a bar and have them squat for like a 1 rep max to test their leg strength or test their overall strength, but they can grip something.
100%. You know, when I was 19, I moved to Portland, Oregon. I was doing this warehouse. I was applying for a warehouse job. Do you know they had you do the repetition of step test like for 3 minutes straight? And then based on how your heart rate was for 3 minutes, as they decide if you're fit enough to have the job.
Wow, I did not know that, but
yep, it was very interesting. What's the guidelines? Speaking of activity, what are guidelines for activity versus the current stats around activity, which is most people struggle to get 3,000 steps from what I've seen, but
yeah, we'll wait till we dive into this one. So if we are to look at the physical activity guidelines set by the CDC, so the Center of Disease Control, we see that they advise adults to do at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity per week. And what they say is that these should be performed in intervals of at least 10 minutes per session. So this is kind of where like some of the data behind like 10-minute walks came in, because they really wanted to look at least 10-minute sessions. So it wasn't just like people doing 2 minutes here, 3 minutes there. And it was at least something that was getting, some cardiovascular adaptation because you were doing it for somewhat of a sustained period. And then also within those CDC guidelines, we see that for additional health benefits, adults should increase their aerobic physical activity to 300 minutes of moderate intensity activity or 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity. But they also note that additional benefits can be gained by engaging in physical activity beyond this amount. So these are what we would consider the bare minimum. So if you guys are just getting started, you're a lifestyle client, a Gen Pop client, you're not really physically active, these are like the baseline minimums that we want for general physical activity as well as health. And then when it comes to resistance training, they say that all adults, so this, it doesn't matter what background you're coming from, that all adults should engage at least in 2 or more days of what is called muscle strengthening activities that are of moderate or high intensity. And that's what we would consider resistance training or like circuit training, something of that sort. So it's clear by these guidelines that they directly advise against inactivity. However, if we actually look at the statistics around activity levels, it's clear that most are falling short of even just the baseline guidelines of engaging in at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity or those 75 minutes of vigorous level intensity aerobic physical activity and the 2 resistance training sessions per week. So we actually just had a recent meta-analysis and systematic review that was released. And it was literally just like in February, so a month, about a month and a half ago. And what they did was they looked at adherence to the aerobic and muscle strengthening activity guidelines across 3.3 million participants and 32 countries, which included the United States. And their analysis found that the overall adherence to the aerobic and resistance training guidelines was only attained by 17% of adults. So 70% of people are actually hitting these minimum guidelines of 150 minutes of physical activity and 2 resistance training sessions per week. So less than 1 in 5 adults are meeting the recommended guidelines, which led them to conclude that large-scale public health interventions promoting both types of exercise are needed to reduce the associated burden of non-communicable diseases. So what we really see is that there might be a lot of people that think they're doing enough, but they're really not even hitting those baseline levels. So it's really important to see these as necessities, these guidelines as bare minimums that we should be hitting on a weekly basis just to maintain health. And from there, we could titrate up in terms of our aerobic activity and our resistance training activity. But really, if health span is of a priority to you, as it is for us, we want to get at least these baseline levels.
How resistance training? Well, then, okay, I guess after that, then how exactly does resistance training and building muscle improve health? Because most people, everybody's a little different. Some people like to go play pickleball for their activity. Some people like to go these sort of things. How do you kind of sell people on a couple of days a week on resistance training because it builds muscle and improve health? How do we kind of work on that?
Man, that was a great way to set this question, my man, because this is a conversation I have so many times. I can't tell you how many times I've had a new client come on board, and I hate to say that I have certain requirements to work with me, but one of them is we are resistance training, because I've just seen, like, I've worked with clients that have come to me and they haven't wanted to resistance train in any capacity. I mean, they don't want to do circuit training. They don't want to do CrossFit. They don't want to do gym work, nothing. And I just haven't been able, especially when it comes to the context of dieting, I'm not able to take those clients on, because if you are to diet without the impetus to maintain, at least maintain muscle through resistance training, you're putting yourself at a large predisposition towards losing body fat and then suffering from that body fat overshooting effect, which we've done a full episode on. But really, how I like look at this entire topic, or how, if you ask me, listen, sell muscle, sell resistance training to the audience, I would say that I see muscle and movement as medicine, and hypertrophy training as a vehicle for building metabolically active tissue, increasing our strength, improving our function, and thus improving health span through all these other effects. And this is because higher levels of muscle mass and higher levels of strength are protective of health and longevity. And I think it's really important to point out that there is this difference between longevity and health span, as lifespan refers to the number of years in one's life, which is more quantitative. These are numbers based, whereas health span is the quality of those years, which is qualitative. And we can improve both through building muscle, hypertrophy training, proper diet, cardio, and movement. But really, our focus should be on quality of those years over quantity. So when we look at how resistance training and building muscle impacts all-cause mortality and longevity, we see that having higher levels of muscle mass, strength, and function are protective against many disease states and have better health as a result, as muscle mass has been linked to better health in many regards. So if we go through like a list of, different situations or different disease conditions, or even just different health effects that muscle has effects on it, like for instance, if we go through things like muscle and insulin sensitivity or blood glucose control, it's been shown that having higher levels of muscle mass and making sure our muscles are active are one of the most effective ways to increase glucose uptake, increase insulin sensitivity, and manage our blood sugar levels. And this is because muscle is the number one site for glucose disposal, which is essential both from a body composition and health perspective, as 80+% of carbohydrate oxidation and glucose disposal occurs via skeletal muscle. And seeing as muscle is the largest site for glucose disposal, the more muscle mass that we have and the more active we are, the less insulin we require to transport carbohydrates. And so what muscle essentially does is it acts as like a sink for glucose. So the more muscle we have, the more glucose we can pretty much pour into that sink and store. And just like if we take this analogy and really extrapolate out to it, if we were to look at muscle as, say, a bathroom sink, well, if a bathroom sink you fill it up too much, it's going to overflow. Yeah, if we think about it, like think about a regular kitchen sink. You go to wash your hands and you leave the tap in there and you let the water run. It's eventually going to overflow if the drain isn't working properly. So what we need to do is contract. We need to move and engage our muscles through exercise and physical activity, as these activities serve as the drain to our glucose sink. So in order to stay in good metabolic health, we need to not only build muscle, but we need to stay active to keep that glucose disposal going. And as we see, like there's so many mechanisms that exercise and muscle has, and benefits that it has on insulin sensitivity, blood glucose control, and all these other things. But also, it's not just about muscle mass and movement, it's also about strength. So we actually see a relationship between hypertrophy training, strength increases, and insulin sensitivity improvements. So for example, just last year, a meta-analysis was done to see how resistance training affects blood sugar levels via HbA1c. So that's what they use as a parameter for gauging someone's level of insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance, as well as looked at how gains in muscle and strength affected a subject's HbA1c levels. And so the study showed that resistance training had a significant effect on lowering HbA1c in and of itself. So just the act of resistance training, engaging in training, improved their blood sugar levels. But what they also saw when they teased out the results, they found that the stronger participants got a better response and improvement in their insulin sensitivity. So for instance, when they looked at the person's baseline level of strength, when it was a progressive overload program, so throughout the course of the program, they got stronger within the resistance training parameters. And those that had a better response in terms of strength, they were able to add more load to the bar, do more reps per set, things of that sort. They saw better improvements in insulin sensitivity. And so we see that resistance training not only independently increases insulin sensitivity by upregulating and activating receptors that suck blood sugar out of the bloodstream, but also getting strong and having that functional muscle is going to lead to better glucose control, better insulin sensitivity, lower HbA1c. Now, when we look at muscle and cardiovascular disease, there's multiple benefits from just resistance training and building muscle. And so when we look at research in individuals who already have some form of heart disease, we see that those who have the highest amount of muscle mass have a lower risk of mortality, whereas those with lower muscle mass are at the greatest risk of mortality from both heart diseases and diseases of all causes. And so muscle mass is protective for those who are looking to not only prevent heart disease, but also for those who already have it. So if you are, you have someone that, a parent, aunt, an uncle, whatever, that has had, cardiovascular disease, has had a myocardial infarction, has had a heart attack, things of that sort, it's still truly beneficial. Now, when we look at muscle mass and bone health, we see that resistance training and building muscle are two of the most important things we can do to build and maintain our bone health and strength across the life course. And this is something we've been really diving into last few weeks as we've been covering relative energy deficiency, because this is one of the number one downstream effects or negative consequences of being in a state of low energy availability and relative energy deficiency. And we see that those who have lower levels of muscle mass are at a higher risk of lowering bone mineral density and suffering from osteoporosis, as having muscle, moving that muscle and putting it under load is the stimulus needed to maintain bone density. And this is how we offset it. So having muscle and being active also leads to, lower risk of falls, which is a big issue for us as we get older. And when we're inactive, we lose what's called type 2 muscle fibers. So that's fast twitch muscle fibers. And this happens in and of itself as we age, which are the fibers that we need to help prevent a fall. And falling at an older age has been really shown to be a very large cause of mortality. So we want to be able to, like I said, look at muscle, look at resistance training as almost like a bank account or a 401k, something we're investing into now that's going to pay us back later on in the future.
What is sarcopenia and its impact in health? You see this in everything about longevity. They say 60 years old, boom, this starts taking a hit and we waste away. And the goal is trying to make sure that doesn't happen. But let's get into it. What is sarcopenia and how does it impact one's health?
All right. So I think a good reason that we should look at this, because this is going to affect more people than we think, because often you just said it, 60 years old. Well, we're going to go over the data. We're seeing it much earlier than that, my man. So a lot of people in the audience, they hear sarcopenia and they're younger. Say they're between the ages of 30 and 50. They just tuned out. And I want you guys to realize that the reason we want to talk about this is because it impacts people of younger age, first and foremost. And second of all, it's a great way to show the necessity of building muscle, because we want to look at how muscle impacts health span. And in order to do so, it's great to look at a condition where we lose muscle mass and what are the effects of that. So essentially, what sarcopenia is the progressive loss of muscle mass as we get older. And we see that after the age of 30, we can experience between a 3 to 8% loss in muscle per decade. And research shows that individuals, or some individuals, will lose 40% of their muscle mass from their 20s to their 80s. Now, another interesting fact about this is you mentioned 60. A lot of books will quote that, but I looked in all the research on this. And it's also been found that muscle mass and strength decrease approximately 10% per decade after the age of 50. So we see from the age of 30, there's a potential. If you're inactive, you're not resistant training, you could lose 3 to 8% in your 30s and in your 40s. Once you hit your 50s, it's that 3 to 8% is now increased to 10%. And we see even more strength loss after the age of 70. So having lower levels of muscle mass, strength, and function and a ratio of high body fat to low muscle mass has been associated with many health conditions and disease states like insulin resistance and diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and dementia. And when we look at sarcopenia, the main contributor to this condition is a lack of exercise and movement, as we need to provide our bodies with a stimulus to build and maintain muscle. As really what we have to look at this as is we have this concept, we always like to say this, like you either use it or lose it. And this is especially true with muscle mass as we age. So lack of exercise predisposes us as we age to more disease conditions, which can cause us to spend extended stays in hospital, which can result in what's called a catabolic crisis, which is when we're bedbound and cannot do anything active while recovering from a sickness or injury. And what we see in the literature is even just short stints of being bedbound can cause deleterious effects, even in healthy individuals. And how they've modeled this, they do something called immobilization studies, which essentially they'll take healthy males, because they don't want to just do it in a disease state. They want to see what are the decrements of becoming sedentary or inactive on healthy, insulin sensitive muscular individuals. And what they do is they put healthy males and they'll put them for 1 to 2 weeks in a bed rest study. And essentially what they've shown is that even just short stints of time with healthy people being sedentary can cause decreases in muscle protein synthesis, decreases in insulin sensitivity, and marked increases in insulin resistance, and significant losses in muscle mass. And the issue with this is it's hard to gain that muscle back especially as we age. So if you're a 20-year-old guy and you go to this bed rest study and you lose some muscle, your protein synthesis rates drop. All right, it's one thing because you're young, you're really, I guess, sensitive to the stimulus of resistance training. But as we get older, there's multiple facets that cause a greater predisposition towards sarcopenia, because when we age or when we get older, we have something called anabolic resistance. And so this refers to the fact that as we age, our body isn't responsive to anabolic stimuli as it was when we were younger. So increasing and maximizing muscle protein synthesis requires a more robust stimulus. And the reason why this is so important is because muscle protein synthesis is the process in which we build muscle. That is the chemical signal that we need to accrete new muscle protein. And when we look at how muscle protein synthesis can be stimulated, there's two ways. And so it can be done by resistance training, or it can be done by ingesting complete protein sources with all the necessary essential amino acids. Yet, when someone is in a state of anabolic resistance, so as we get older, we usually see this over the age of 40. When someone is in a state of anabolic resistance, they tend to need a larger dose of both training and protein to sufficiently trigger an MPS response. So as we age, we need a larger bolus of protein to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis as compared to when we were younger. So when we actually look at like protein research studies, we see that in research for those in their 20s, muscle protein synthesis can be maximized at a protein dose of around 25. So there's like research studies where they compare kids in college, because that's like a really easy demographic to work with. So college age kids, maybe 20 years old, and they'll give them 25 grams of protein post workout, and they'll look at the maximum or the muscle protein synthesis rates in those 20-year-olds compared to like 40-year-olds. And what they see is that in the 20-year-olds, 25 grams of, say, a whey protein is able to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But in the 40-year-olds, they have a marked decrease in muscle protein synthesis, so they're not even maximizing it with that dose. And so what research has also shown is that in order to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis in older individuals, we need to use at least a 40-gram dose of protein. So essentially, like that's what anabolic resistance is referring to. You have a lowered degree of response to anabolic stimuli, including protein, including resistance training. So it's important to note that one way to, there's multiple ways to overcome this sarcopenic state and the state of anabolic resistance. And the two best ways: increase protein intake and maintain a high level of protein intake and protein dosing and all the things that come with nutrition, nutrient timing and things of that sort, but also to stay active throughout the entire, the entirety of your life course, because this helps to undo a lot of the effects of anabolic resistance and sarcopenia.
How muscle impacts all-cause mortality. There's a lot of studies that show this, that, and the other thing, but one study, or the studies that usually show muscle, from what I have seen, always have a higher longevity. So it seems to help with lowering all-cause mortality, because even walking lowers all-cause mortality, and that's a form of adding lean mass to one's legs to some degree, depending upon XYZ, perhaps, if you take
no, it's funny when you take an untrained person and you put them in a cardiovascular training program, they have an increase in hypertrophy. Like we see that during the first couple of weeks of their training, which is remarkable, because none of us would say, let's do cardio to get gains, but it is something we see.
Yeah, no, it's I personally believe in it. I think cardio is the missing component. Most people's thing. I think the part that people should embrace about building muscle and being a bodybuilder or anything with physique is be an athlete. You're called a physique athlete, and you're not an athlete if you get out of breath by fucking going up a flight of stairs. Yeah, 20 rep hack squat. That people are like, oh, it's too high rep training. I'm like, God, you guys grew up in a soft generation. But how does muscle impact all-cause mortality?
All right, so having more muscle in general is protective and will lower all-cause mortality, but it's important to realize that the muscle, what we want is we want functional muscle. So we can't just have it, we need to move it and we need to use it, essentially. So building muscle and strength is a hugely beneficial investment, as they provide us with a bigger buffer to lose from later in life. So like I mentioned, with sarcopenia, if you are someone that has built like this great reservoir of muscle, like you've built this suit of armor, like you have more to lose from. Whereas if you are someone that is under muscled, over fat and under muscled, which is the average American, to be honest with you, if you're over fat, under muscled, and you're getting into your fourth, fifth, sixth decade of life, now you have less reserve to lose from, and you're probably more likely to lose because you're inactive and you're not stimulating your muscles and the hypertrophic stimulus as much. And so we don't want to just purely look at muscle mass when it comes to increasing health span, as we can technically gain more lean body mass just by gaining more weight and fat, which is why it's important to focus also on not only increasing muscle mass, but increasing muscle strength. And this is why muscle strength is a good indicator of muscle function and health. And it shows that we not only have muscle, but we're using it and can produce high levels of force. Now, when we actually look at the data on this, it's really interesting because there's all these different research studies and meta-analysis that look at BMI, they look at muscle mass, and then they also look at rates of mortality. But we really got to pull this apart. So I'm going to go through different levels of the literature so that we get a better, a clearer vision of what we're looking for and looking at. So when we look at the hazard ratios, because we have to, the real reason for this is because we have to pull apart adiposity, because someone could be, essentially what it could be is someone could be obese and have a higher level of fat-free mass than someone like me or Jeff, because they're 300 or 400 pounds. However, so if we were to look at just muscle mass in terms of fat-free mass, they would have a higher level of total or absolute fat-free mass, but they're not going to have better mortality rates than someone like you or myself. So we have to pull apart fat mass and fat-free mass. And so when we look at hazard ratios, which indicate the likelihood of all-cause mortality, like I said, we need to pull apart BMI, muscle mass, and strength, as these can conflict with one another. So for example, having a higher BMI is generally linked to higher hazard ratios and higher rates of all-cause mortality. So we see in the literature that those with a BMI from 30 to 35 have a hazard ratio of 1.3. So what that means is they have a 30% increased risk of mortality. Now, when we look at the next category of BMI of those from 35 to 40, they have a hazard ratio of 1.9. So they have a 90% increased risk of mortality. And then, so that's just looking at adipose, of looking at total body mass. Now, if we look at lack of strength, because remember, like I said, we need high muscle mass and high muscle strength. When someone has low grip strength, which is an indication of low muscle strength, they have a hazard ratio of 1.42, meaning that they're at a 42% increased risk of mortality. But then, we have other research that really pulls this apart. So in 2018, there was a population cohort study done on muscle mass, BMI, and mortality amongst adults in the United States. And in this study, they looked at BMI and all-cause mortality and found that as BMI increased, so did the hazard ratio for all-cause mortality. So the more that we saw BMI increase, the higher predisposition people had to be at a greater risk for dying, essentially. But then they reanalyzed the data in each group and separated them by not only BMI, but also by those with low muscle mass and what they labeled as preserved muscle mass. And what that was it was pretty much just a disparate difference between low muscle mass and higher levels of muscle mass. And when doing this, they found that not only was the risk of all-cause mortality lower for those who preserved muscle mass as compared to those with low muscle mass, but muscle mass was protective in terms of every BMI category from 18.5 to 40. So essentially, skeletal muscle mass modifies the association of BMI with adiposity and with mortality, which shows how protective having muscle is to lowering the risk of all-cause mortality. Then we also have research that looks at the combined upper and lower body strength and all-cause mortality. And what they found was that the more muscular strength we maintain as we age, the lower our all-cause mortality risk as compared to those in the weak strength group. So you not only have to have the muscle, like I said, you have to have the muscular strength. So we want to, we want functional muscle. We want to actually utilize this. And then in the last category, when we look at the most recent systematic review on resistance training, so the stimulus needed to build muscle and all-cause mortality, there was a 2019 systematic review and meta-analysis on the association between resistance training, mortality, and all these things. And they found that resistance training in and of it by itself led to a 21% reduction in all-cause mortality. Then they also looked at combining resistance training with aerobic training. And within that, when you combine both, so like the best of both worlds, like you were alluding to, Jeff, they saw that the all-cause mortality risk was reduced by 40%.
Yeah.
So it was like almost 1 + 1 = 3. So there's a synergistic effect of combining both resistance and aerobic training. And so on today's episode, we really spoke about muscle mass and resistance training and its benefits on all-cause mortality. But I would love to, in the next episode, if we go through separately how cardiovascular training, how steps, and some other activities of daily living or physical activity in affects and can increase or decrease all-cause mortality risk. So we really have like a full series on this and really how to increase your health span, better your longevity, and live a life by design where you're not only looking better, because it's great that we do these things to look better in the moment when we're young and we're active and we're really focused on the body composition aspects. And I get a lot of clients, that are in their 30s and 40s and they're really body composition focused, which I love. Don't get me wrong. Like, we want to look better, but I also want you to feel better. I want you to age better. I want you to be there for your kids, for your grandchildren. children. And I know that's a huge thing for you as well as a father. And so these are things I'm really trying to bridge the gap between. I kind of look at it. It's funny. I had a conversation earlier this morning, and how I termed this was I'm trying to find the convergence between hypertrophy and health span. And how can we meet in the middle between, like I always say, a healthy body's a responsive body, but also can we find like this middle of the road approach where we optimize for body composition, but also for health. So not only can we look good in the moment, but we can look good long term.
Dude, fantastic episode. I'm all for that. I think I'm big into longevity stuff. We can even talk about an episode on supplements, an episode on the nutrition piece, because that's where a lot of that keto comes into play on that, the longevity stuff. But yeah, dude, that was fantastic. Where can everybody find you at? Give you a follow.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. So feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at @BrandonDeCruz_. My email, if you guys have any inquiries for coaching or questions, is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. And Jeff, over to you. Wrap us on out, my man.
Instagram /Jeff Unbreakable Black, and then Relentless Forever on YouTube. Be sure to check us out. I'd love for y'all to give me some feedback on those videos, what y'all think on the Q&A. That was stuff we put up in our question boxes and got, decided answers. So anyway, B dude, I'll check you next week, man. Have yourself a fantastic day.
You too, my man. Always a pleasure.
Peace.